So, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for your patience. We're waiting for people to enter the room. And before we start, I wanted to use this opportunity to briefly thank the special team that has made this possible. Luciana, Ezekiel, and Tiziana for letting us from the Critical Computation Bureau and our audience witness the joy of their intellectual exchange. I wanted to thank Brian D'Aquino for transposing this event in the digital universe with such smoothness and genius. And Olga Solombrino and Alessandra Ferlito for their illuminating pieces on the artists we've showcased on our website. And the most special thanks to the people who have translated our dream into codes, art, and contagious visuals. Our webmaster, Valerio Figliolo, and our graphic animation and social media artists, Alessandro D'Aquino and Gaetano Quattromani. So, this is the 8th event of the virtual symposium, Recursive Colonialism, Artificial Intelligence, and Speculative Computation. We are the Critical Computation Bureau, a collective of researchers, artists, and writers working at the intersection of technology and culture, computer science, and informational theory, aesthetics, and politics. So Recursive Colonialism, Artificial Intelligence, and Speculative Computation 2020 aims to provide interventions in the technopolitics of racial capitalism and its recursive regeneration, mixing together critical and creative practices and borrowing models and methods from philosophy of technology, Black studies, political theory, computer science, and information theory, media aesthetics, cultural and digital media theories. Please check our manifesto on the website and the online journal issue Controlled Societies at 30, published online in social text. We also thank Duke University, which has sponsored this symposium, together with University of Pennsylvania and l'Università di Napoli L'Orientale. For more information on this project, feel free to check out the website, recursivecolonialism.com, and to follow the event's socials. My name is Oana Pârvan. My co-facilitator today is Brian D'Aquino. We've called this day of the symposium episode 8, Politics from Within Borders. And we've associated today's panel with the screening of FF Guide and Delete by Laria Champong and David Blandy. You can find more information on the video on our website, accompanied by an original text written by our curators, Alessandra Ferlito and Olga Solombrino. The format of this session will be the following. Our guests will each talk for approximately 10-15 minutes each. After that, the speakers will address a few questions that you can type into your Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please remember to state clearly which speaker your question is addressed to. Our co-facilitator will pick up as many questions as possible, and the chair will address them to the panelists. I also want to remember all panelists not to check the Q&A box, as all questions will be verbally asked by the chair. Please type in your questions in the Q&A box at any time of the session. This session is streamed live on our YouTube channel. Now I will briefly introduce today's panelists. They will be presenting in this order, and the abstract of their presentations are available on our website. Ozgun Eylul Iscen is a media theorist whose scholarship engages with artistic and philosophical practice. She received her PhD in computational media, arts, and cultures from Duke University in 2020. Her dissertation examines counter-visual artistic practices that intervene in the material conditions of ethical legal systems underlying the extractive operations of computational media in the context of the Middle East. Eylul has updated the title of her intervention, which is now The Racial Politics of Smartness Mandate, Counterfuturisms Arising from the Middle East. Nick Dyer-Witherford is a professor in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at University of Western Ontario, Canada. He is author of Cyber Marx, University of Illinois, 1999, and co-author of Digital Play, McGill Queens, 2003, Games of Empire, University of Minnesota Press, 2009, Cyber Proletariat, Pluto, 2015, and the co-author of Inhuman Power, Pluto, 2019. Martina Tazzioli is lecturer in politics and technology at Goldsmiths, University of London. She works on migration and borders in the Mediterranean region. She is the author of The Making of Migration, the Biopolitics of Mobility at Europe's Borders, 2019, Tunisia as a Revolutionized Space of Migration, 2017 with Glenda Garelli, and Spaces of Governmentality, Autonomous Migration and the Arab Uprisings, 2014. Her work explores the biopolitical mechanisms by which some subjects are racialized and governed as quote-unquote migrants, analyzing the intertwining of modes of objectivation and subjectivities. More recently, she has investigated the technologization of the border regime and how technologies constitute a battlefield for migrant states and non-state actors. Welcome to you all, and over to Eylul.
Thank you, Oana and Brian, and the Critical Computation Bureau. I'm very happy to be on this panel with the fellow participants. And I will have some images on my slides with some captions, which will accompany my talk. But if you have any questions, I would be happy to talk about them more afterwards. And I will start with this image. In October 2020, the final piece of the facade of Dubai's Museum of the Future, a much anticipated engineering marvel of the city, was installed. The technologically advanced building with Arabic calligraphy on its exterior was made possible by 3D design and manufacturing. The museum is one of the many initiatives of the Dubai Future Foundation, which was founded in 2015 as a public-private partnership to promote the country's goal of becoming a global hub for future technologies. The museum is located on the logistics corridor of the city, across the financial district, and next to the Emirates Towers, which host the Area 2071, allocated for the United Arab Emirates Sustainable Development Plan. The museum has built upon successive annual exhibitions since 2015, when it was first announced. I will continue with the one that was held 2017, titled Climate Change Reimagined, Dubai 2050. The exhibition aimed at rethinking how we might face the challenges of climate change via investments in science and technology. Yet their repetitive emphasis on transforming the challenges of climate change into economic opportunities reflects the accelerated dominance of what Orit Halpern calls Smartness mandate, deeply shaped by the trajectories of crisis, urban planning, and computation, especially in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis. The sequence that you see on the slide comes from the immersive audiovisual display presented at the exhibition. The first image represents today as the past of the future, whereas the second image depicts Dubai in 2050. It's a perfect illustration of Smartness mandate, the autocratic belief in the tech-enabled solutions to possible urban collapse scenarios. The promotional video depicts the smart future of Dubai as a peaceful and sustainable place, in a sharp contrast to the unruly and chaotic scenes that are currently unfolding on the streets across the Middle East. Indeed, this contrast manifests the massively polarized accumulation of wealth and class formation in the region, marked by the domination of Gulf capital and US imperialism. Along with long-standing linkages with the US military, the United Arab Emirates has become a keynote in the commercial, military, and humanitarian nexus, with the help of extra statecraft, to use Kellery Stilling's term, a set of zones, devices, and narratives that materialize in infrastructural space. While facing post-oil futures, the United Arab Emirates' economic diversification is led by Dubai's multimodal logistics platforms as an important node within the global supply chain. The dramatic urban transformation in Dubai and in the Gulf at large, however, thrives on the deep exploitation of non-citizen labor via the kafala sponsorship system. Under the kafala system, migrant workers are denied most of their labor and civil rights. In most cases, the quality of living, housing, food, and medical treatment is insufficient. The accelerated digitization of city spaces and services indicates a risk for further marginalization of non-citizen workers via the securitization of everyday life, especially low-waged workers who are already confined within the segregated design of the city, such as labor camps, and systematically pushed into informality. The context of the Gulf promotes a transnational perspective to examine the role of smart urbanism within global supply chain capitalism in Anna Tissing's terms. The collusion of extractive, logistical, and financial operations accelerated by digital infrastructures has not diminished, but intensified capital's dependence on a racialized and gendered division of labor, traversing the toil of bodies in factories, on ports, at dump sites, and within homes. In other words, capital's expanding frontiers of extraction prey on the economic and political vulnerabilities led by the long intersecting histories of colonialism, racism, and patriarchy, which constitute the recursive imperial order of capitalism. In contrast to the profit-driven, high-tech spectacles of Gulf capital, I look at the war-torn and toxic seas spreading through the rest of the region, such as Beirut. The Gulf's oil belt not only sustains the power of ruling elites and authoritarian regimes, but has also radiated out to the broader region through government aid and corporate investments, as we see in the case of Lebanon. The development of post-Civil War capitalism in Lebanon since the 1990s is marked by its integration into Gulf rentierism via real estate and finance. During the widespread anti-establishment protests that began in Lebanon in October 2019, the protesters chanted against not only the sectarian clientelist regime, but also the rule of banks while attacking ATMs and bank headquarters. In the meantime, however, Lebanon has come under the spotlight regarding its treatment of refugees and migrant workers, exposing the racialized modes of poverty and violence perpetuating in the country. Therefore, my critical analysis of smart urbanism underscores the entangled relationship between the patterns of devalued labor and the unevenly distributed impacts of environmental degradation in the region and beyond. For instance, the spreading toxicity in Beirut, caused by the failure of public services such as waste management and the collapse of public healthcare, contributes to the increasing need for private care, including domestic care provided by low-wage migrant workers. These workers, mostly women, arrive from Southeast Asia and Africa via the exploitative kafala system. As their legal status and well-being are tied to their employers, they are structurally rendered vulnerable to all kinds of exploitation and abuse, including the most intimate form of racism. Ultimately, the profit-driven high-tech spectacles of smart futures obscures the very invisibility of these dispossessed communities across the global North-South divide, who suffer from their material implications while being unable to imagine a sustainable future for themselves. Where capital hits the ground, however, there arises a possibility of contestation, a possibility of controversiality. In response to their unfair working and living conditions, migrant workers and their allies have been mobilizing for collective demands, which ultimately involves calling for the abolishment of the kafala system. Despite their spatial confinement and their lack of rights, dozens of highly visible strikes have swept across the Gulf since the mid-2000s. In Lebanon, domestic migrant workers who were excluded from the labor law, along with their Lebanese counterparts, established a domestic workers' union in 2016, the first of its kind in the Arab world. Forced by the public visibility of such organized efforts, the hosting countries initiated some labor reforms, even though they are not enough. To address the structural mechanisms underlying the kafala system, grassroots groups are growing in number and strength, especially in Lebanon, taking an explicitly feminist and anti-racist approach while building alternative networks of care and information. Countering the totalizing image of smartness mandate, these urban struggles shift our gaze towards frictions through which computational capital operates. In opposition to the speculative narratives of what Mark Fisher calls science fictional capital, these organized efforts negotiate the broader politics of space, time, and visuality, which are always entangled with the differential impacts of global capital. According to Paula Chakrabarty and Denis Ferreira da Silva, it's not enough to map how global capital accumulates on racial difference, but also how racial violence is morally, ethically, or legally justified. In other words, we need to dismantle its normative formations, such as the racialized regimes of citizenship. In this regard, those feminist and anti-racist efforts mobilized for the evolution of the kafala system, traversing different social classes and geographies, affirm an aesthetic exceeding the one of state-capital nexus that reproduces social hierarchies based on race, gender, citizenship, and geopolitics. They enact counterfuturism by envisioning alternatives to the futurity that Gulf futurism propels. Gulf futurism is a term coined by Sophia Murray and Fatima Al-Qadri almost a decade ago to unpack the historicity and totality of the urban and technological development in the Gulf over the last few decades. The term helps us to situate Blade Runner fantasies of oil wealth alongside the concomitant issues of exploited human labor, devastated desert ecology, historical amnesia, and religious extremism, which ultimately manifest the pillars and terrors of neoliberal governance. In this sense, Gulf futurism becomes a projection of our global future, reversing the temporality promoted by Smart Futures of Dubai, projecting towards 2050. We can locate the present of the Middle East not as the past of the future, but the projection of the conditions the rest of the world is moving towards. This is why it is so important to witness and become an ally of counterfuturisms arising from urban struggles and artistic practices in the region. As Dusi Pareka argues, counterfuturisms, which take various audiovisual and narrative forms, complicate the cultural politics of future and technology. What is striking for me that these artists contest the speculative fictions of smart urbanism by not only exposing the material conditions and limits of such speculations, but also emphasizing the generative and subversive capacity of bodies in the face of biopolitical debility. As the smartness mandate demonstrates, however, the logic of resilience is operative to the functioning of capital itself. Yet, these efforts for collective care are not only compensation for the lack of social protection, but carries the potential of producing new kinds of political imaginaries and collectivities, probing locally established universalities in their praxis. And I would like to end with the following slide. As most of you know, the August 4th explosion in Beirut and coupled with COVID-19 has left many migrant domestic workers jobless and homeless. And these are the grassroots groups actually that I briefly mentioned in my presentation, and you could help their evacuation efforts by following them on social media and support in any way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eylul, for your presentation and for this reflection on smart urbanism. That was very necessary, and for the connections within the Middle East. We're going to go now to our next presentation, which is a video presentation, and I'm going to share it. So.
great to be here at Recursive.
I'll be signed into the symposium, but it's great to be here at Recursive Colonialisms. I'll be signed into the symposium, but I've recorded my talk in advance. Thanks to the organizers of this event, and thanks also to my collaborators in the collective and ongoing project from which this talk derives, Michel Lieu, Jaime Brenes-Reyes, and Sananda Sahu, all or some of whom may be here today and can add their distinctive voices to discussion of our topic, riot platforms, protest, police, planets. The last 3 years have seen social unrest on a world scale not witnessed since the late 1960s. In 2018-19, there was a sequence of urban uprisings in Paris, Hong Kong, Santiago, Quito, Beirut, Barcelona, Tehran, and Baghdad, and many other locations. 2020 has seen the explosion of Black Lives Matter in the United States and around the world, as well, again, as many other upheavals. This tumult has been termed a global revolt against neoliberalism. This may be an overly clean diagnosis, but there are clearly commonalities amongst the uprisings. Outrage over inequality, immiseration, state corruption, and police brutality. Protesters engage in sustained, intense conflict with security forces, conflicts which we can call riots, providing we strip that term of its normal pejorative connotations. These battles in the street also involve the use of digital networks and social media by both sides, the riot platforms on which we focus here. Two theoretical concepts are useful, concepts of circulation and cycles. As we all know, in Marxism, the point of production is held to be the heart of capital, and the strike workers' key weapon. Against this, recent theorists such as Joshua Clover have argued that at certain points in capitalism's history, including its current post-industrial moment, production is subsumed in the wider processes of circulation, in which commodities go to market. Capital's major points of vulnerability therefore become the roads, rails, ships, planes, pipelines, and networks that commodities must traverse to realize their value in exchange. And the viable protest thus becomes the interruption of these circulatory flows, the rail blockade, the street-stopping march, the airport occupation, the citywide disruption. Circulatory flows involve digital networks, and these too become points of resistance. Such network resistance now has quite a long history, so our second theoretical concept is that of a cycle of struggles. Speaking very schematically, we can identify three pulses in one cycle, running from the start of the 21st century. In the late 1990s, altermondialism tried to develop an electronic fabric of struggle focused in indie media centers operating outside a still nascent .com digital capitalism. In the 2010s, Occupy movements organized their Take the Square actions from inside emergent corporate platforms, hence the hyperbolic moniker of Facebook or YouTube or Twitter revolutions. Today's urban uprisings, however, draw jagged asymmetrical division across these platforms in fierce contestations between police and protesters. What are the elements of riot platforms from the point of view of protesters? Corporate open platforms such as Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter continue to be important for the incubation and propagation of protests. The Gilets jaunes emerged from a ferment of Facebook pages. Twitter has been important in protracted social rebellions such as those in Lebanon. The state's powers of panoptic observation and preemption have often not been sufficient to prevent huge mobilizations of street power by online means. The guardians are sometimes left watching a slow-motion explosion. At the same time, as these revolts hit the streets, confront police, and escalate, surveillance and counter-surveillance become central issues. Many revolts occur in putatively smart cities, primed with sensors, readers, and cameras of all kinds, including AI-driven facial recognition systems. Riot platforming therefore develops a repertoire of anonymization, camouflage, and obfuscation techniques The Hong Kong protests were the test grounds for this, including dramatic moments such as the use of lasers to disable facial recognition systems. Conversely, surveillance, de-anonymizing and sometimes doxing police, documenting brutality, disseminating these records instantaneously and globally, and digitally archiving the memory of revolt against official erasure becomes critical. End-to-end encryption apps such as WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, and also virtual private networks have been central. The availability of these apps is, I would argue, the legacy of the previous Occupy cycle of struggles, and in particular of the revelations of Edward Snowden, which forced privacy measures on embarrassed commercial providers of digital services. Inherited by a new generation of protesters, these apps have become riot coordination weapons. Telegram was termed the nervous system of the Hong Kong revolt. In Chile, the widespread use of WhatsApp enabled the fast, widespread student organizing of turnstile-jumping metro fare avoidance that ignited the uprising. In these processes, distinctions between street and network dissolve. The two are thoroughly imbricated and entangled. Crowdsourced maps of police activities and digitally managed just-in-time logistical supply of protesters with water, food, medical care, anti-tear gas agents becomes critical. On-the-fly, open-source digital riot coordination is used to handle Hong Kong-style be-water strategies involving very high fluidity of tactics, fast collective decisions about demonstrations that turn into marches, that become blockades, that spawn wildcat offshoots, are sometimes taken online in anonymized and encrypted forums. How are governments responding to these protest riot platforms? In the Arab Spring, internet blackouts were an immediate repressive regime answer to uprisings. But subsequently, it appeared that despotic governments were leaving social media on in order to better monitor social movements and entrap activists. There were suggestions that this would in fact become the new normal of protest environments. But it isn't that simple. Today in Ecuador and Iraq, and particularly Iran, selective or near total blackouts of digital networks have occurred as protests peak. In addition, many contexts have seen hacks aimed specifically at encrypted apps, such as the blackouts of Telegram. At the same time, the use of big data analytics scanning of social media to identify suspects for arrest and to provide evidence for prosecution accelerate to new intensities with the deployment of drones and facial recognition surveillance, now supplied by a proliferating police industrial complex. However, another aspect which has caught our attention is the use of social media to recruit and incite what might be called deputized vigilantism. Our case study here has been from India, with the Modi BJP's government's use of well-organized social media cells to provoke deadly violence in Delhi against demonstrations protesting its Islamophobic citizenship policies. This provides a disturbing example of a digitally state-provoked reactionary riot. And these are fast, we believe, becoming part of the state's full-spectrum response to platform riots. All these features, both of protest power and police power, are apparent in the Black Lives Matter protest that has convulsed the United States and the world this year. Of course, this rebellion has features entirely specific to the black struggles against American white supremacism, but it also has affinities with and connections to wider revolts. Black Lives Matter is a movement of hashtag activism constituted by digital capacities to record, disseminate, aggregate, and narrate anti-black police violence. Its past and current uprisings in the streets involve multi-platform use to coordinate demonstrations, monitor police movements and attacks, disseminate information about arrests, tear gas, and surveillance, as well as direct hacking of police data banks and snitch lines, and also transnational networked circulation of inspiration and information. On the other hand, Black Lives Matter has also seen deployed against it a vast and virulent apparatus of surveillance and arrest with intense police scanning of social media flows. It has also featured the head of state, President Trump, speaking in the name of law and order to incite right-wing militias, which are themselves intensely networked, whose armed interventions have set in motion what many in the United States fear to be a civil war dynamic. Black Lives Matter is only one of the movements which has continued the wave of riot platforms or platformed riots into the pandemic era. We see examples in Thailand, Nigeria, Belarus, and elsewhere around the planet. This new period has also seen the added complication of forms of riot against anti-COVID regulations, riots which divide different elements of the subordinated classes over imperatives, competing imperatives of safety and income, which capital renders contradictory. So the situation continues to unfold in ways that a quick talk really cannot do justice to it. However, we can say that platformed confrontation between protest and police is now a central feature of national security's attempts and often failures to control their own populations in an era of inequality, precarity, and massive epidemiological and ecological trauma. This process has dangerous aspects and many repressive and reactionary dynamics, but also radical powers. Platform riots are no silver bullet against world capitalism. Many of the movements discussed here have been defeated, exhausted, or are in the process of disintegration. However, they have also won victories, even if partial ones. In Chile, the revocation of the fascist-era constitution in a national referendum following the 2019 revolt stands out. In other places, rioters have extracted material concessions, even if this by no means fulfill the aspirations for a just society they have unleashed. Riots and their platforms are now a site of innumerable experiments in mutual aid and pop-up solidarities. And they are cauldrons for new emancipatory themes of police defunding, of post-colonial sovereignty, and of debates over the relation between the payday end of the month and the climate change end of the world. These discussions and ideas circulate digitally between movements, along with tactical information disseminated around the world. In both their successes and failures, riot platforms today offer a curriculum for a school of speculative politics. To conclude with a recursion, digital networks have their origins in the military-industrial complexes of the Cold War, and such war preparations today continue apace. So too do the application of their techniques against domestic populations in the process that Paul Virilio termed endo-colonization. Riot platforms, however, add a further recursive twist to this spiral, as new movements fight to end endo-colonization by reappropriation of its networks. Technocratic concepts of planetary computing that do not reckon with such turmoils display a fatal blind spot. Platform riots are now a crucial term in digital capitalism's brutal equation. As Marx would have said, hic Rhodus, hic Salta. This is the world we are in. This is the struggle, now.
Thank you, Nick, for your presentation. And thank you so much for drawing on so many examples of what you call counter-logistics, and for bringing up the important aspect of endo-colonialism. I'm sure we're going to be able to discuss this in the questions. And I'll leave the floor to Martina, and then we can open up to the questions.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to Oana, Pârvan, and Brian D'Aquino, and to all members of the Critical Computation Bureau for organizing this event. So today I'm going to speak about my current research project entitled Extractive Humanitarianism, Refugees, Unpaid Labor, and Participatory Detention. And this project starts from a very basic assumption that over the last few years, digital technologies have been increasingly incorporated in refugee governance. And there are in particular some countries that have worked as kind of a bench test for experimenting these technologies on vulnerable and displaced population. For instance, I want just to share an image of a specific, what happens in a refugee camps, Zatari refugee camp in Jordan. In this camp, refugees, asylum seekers are identified with the iris scan, and then with the same code, they are able to purchase food and products within the camp. So this is a very iconic image that circulated a lot on the web of this woman who is able to buy. So there is this food with her eyes. So there is this like twofold aspect of technology to monitor, track refugees, but also to guarantee like digital identity and support them. So Jordan is one of the many sites when this technology are experimented, and this kind of experimentation has been very much addressed in recent literature from the point of view of the increased surveillance and also the new modes of control enacted in refugee camps. And also other scholars have stressed how technologies might be appropriated by refugees and how might end up in empowering refugees themselves. So actually, I want to, in my project, I want to move beyond this nexus between control and surveillance on the one hand and refugees empowerment on the other, and to gesture towards an analysis of the value, the multiple forms of value produced through data extraction activities and unpaid labor in camps. And so if you want on the centrality, I'm interested in the centrality of extractive process in techno-humanitarianism. So here I introduced in the project the notion of extractive humanitarianism to designate the central role played by data extraction and knowledge extraction operation in refugee governance and the unpaid labor that refugees are requested to perform, or better are pushed, nudged to perform. And this is very important because they are not obliged to perform this unpaid labor. They are nudged to perform this labor in the name of their own good, right? So in the name, under the promise that if they do this kind of labor, the system, the refugee system will improve and it will be like a more fair system. So relatedly, extractive humanitarians point to the incorporation of refugees into their own control. So what I call participatory detention, this promise that the system might improve. And this echo in part Stefano Arni and Fred Moten's expression of like this invitation to governmentality. However, we have to consider that in this case is actually kind of participatory detention in the sense that you can imagine people are in this kind of like highly asymmetrical position with the same with respect to the humanitarian actors and international agency that ask them to perform this kind of activities. So the analytics of extraction, I suggest, enable grasping key practices of unpaid labor and forms of value production in refugee humanitarianism. In fact, following Sandro Mezzadre and Brett Nilsson, extractive operation are at stake, I quote, not only when the operation of capital plunder the materiality of the earth and biosphere, but also when they encounter and draw upon forms and practices of human cooperation and sociality that are external to them. So first of all, it's important to highlight that migrants who seek asylum in Europe are constantly targeted by this extractive operation and not only in camps. For instance, soon after landing in Europe, the first officers that they encounter are the officers of the European organization, sorry, just Frontex. And this is, well, one of their official documents. So as you can see, they organize these debriefing activities in which they point to the need of a systematic extraction of information for intelligent purposes from migrants willing to cooperate. And this is willing to cooperate is extremely important for the reason I said, right? The way in which they justify. And all this information are used for understanding, I quote, their roots and modus operandi. So, of course, questioning the multiple forms of value production in refugee governance and as part of this techno-humanitarianism involves also questioning the way in which value production has been addressed in the literature. So there is a quite wide scholarship that has explored the so-called migration industry and border security industry. That is the way in which private actors, private contractors capitalize on the body of the migrants detained in detention centers, for instance, or how high-tech companies are like making profit out of migrants. But I think that is important also to rethink values beyond this first, like this direct industrial profit made by private actors, and to understand and to interrogate ourselves on the way in which asylums, the mobility and the conducts, the behavior of refugees becomes source of potential or actual capitalization. So as the anthropologist Ruben Anderson has observed, it becomes key to understand how migrants and their bodies were rendered useful beyond their labor power, so beyond becoming like a cheap labor force. And as I also address in an article co-authored with Claudia Aradao entitled Biopolitics Multiple, we investigate what we call these modes of biopolitical value that are generated in refugee governance through this datification process that mainly concern refugees' conduct. So let me start with data extraction. This data extraction process that in my research I mainly investigate in Greece. Greece, in fact, is a very interesting country, in my opinion, for many reasons. And I just want to mention two. The first one is that Greece is the first country where the European Commission implemented the first refugee cash assistance program in 2017, which consists in prepaid cards that are like MasterCard sponsored and that are given to asylum seekers in camps and in the hotspot. So I just want to briefly show these images. So this is how the UNHCR present the program. The UNHCR is like the partner, right, of the European Commission in this program, and the financial provider involved is based in London. It's called Prepaid Financial Services. So as part of this program, asylum seekers are kind of transformed into temporary card users, although I think is a kind of misleading thinking of as the refugees as becoming these like kind of homo economicus, right? This neoliberal subject that is like turned into consumers for many reasons that I'm happy to explain more in the Q&A, but basically there are multiple restrictions that refugees who receive these cards are obliged to comply with. So I think we need to rethink also the kind of economic subject that emerge from this. And secondly, Greece is interesting, not so much because it's such an advanced bench test, right? Indeed, if you think about Greece, the images that you probably have in mind of like the hotspot in Lesbos, people live in these super overcrowded conditions and are exposed to police brutality that is, of course, backed up by the European Union. And at the same time, there are this kind of experimentation going on. And importantly, the cash assistance program is not the only technological tool that asylum seekers deal with. Indeed, asylum seekers in Greece, in particular since 2015, have been kind of turned into what I call forced hinder techno users. Because technologies, but also very banal technologies and apps such as Viber, WhatsApp, and Skype are used on a daily basis by asylum seekers, or better, they are forced to navigate this panoply of apps first, as long as they want to access humanitarian services and financial services. And let me show another example, another aspect of this. So we have this Viber app, Viber community that has been implemented recently in Greece. And this is the only way, the only channels that asylum seekers have to communicate and to receive information from the asylum office. So basically the Greek authorities, but also from the UNHCR in Lesbos about what is going on, the legal situation, legal updates, political updates, but also urgent news, right? And using Viber, well, is not so straightforward when you don't have a smartphone, or you don't have internet connectivity, or basically you don't know how to use Viber. So to me, it's important that beyond question of control and surveillance, actually this technology, more than tracking refugees, because refugees are tracked also in many other ways, right? Through the fingerprinting mechanism, first of all, this technology obstructs refugees' access to asylum, rights, and financial support. So as part of as being turned into techno users and into card users, they are source of data extraction. And for instance, asylum seekers' card transactions are constantly monitored, both by the UNHCR and by the financial provider. And however, what I could get from my fieldwork is that this data is not used again for tracking them, but for producing statistics about refugee population as consumers, and for producing like larger reports about refugees population as such, but also risk analysis. So when I speak about value, we don't need to consider value as through like a unique logics, right? To me, what is interesting in this in techno-humanitarianism and refugees economies is precisely this multiple source of value production and one of these is definitely data circulation. And on this regard, I think the work of the political geographer Lauren Martin is extremely important to rethink value. So, however, asylum seekers are not only turned into passive source of data extraction, but they are also constantly interpolated, as I said at the very beginning, to the example of Frontex, as techno users and as consumers. And so this is what happens also in Greece, where asylum seekers that receive this card are also asked to, or better, pushed and invited to take part to these multiple surveys. This is a survey which contains 130 questions, and to focus group and to individual interviews. And these surveys and multiple forms of interpellation are part of UNHCR post-distribution monitoring activities. So as part of these post-distribution monitoring activities, migrants are asked information about how they use their card, but also, and technology, but also other questions. For instance, have you ever ended up in doing one of these things? For instance, wash or shower less frequently because you didn't have enough money, right? Or also, for instance, how do you meet your basic needs? Have you ever been involved in begging or use of saving or informal works? So this kind of knowledge production that is not something marginal actually, because it becomes like the raw material used by agencies like UNHCR, but also Frontex and IOM to generate knowledge about the refugee population. And we know that knowledge production is key in migration and refugee governance for producing risk analysis, profiling migrants, and also producing the statistics about the refugee population as potential consumers. And finally, of course, for recommending governments of implementing new policies. So to conclude, because I think my time is coming to an end, to me it's very important to politicize and highlights these modes of value production that in turn highlights invisible forms of exploitation that are not ever accounted as exploitation because they are not seen as labor, right? And what I do in this work, I try to build on feminist literature on unpaid labor to look at possible continuities and connection between forms of exploitation in refugee governance and in other sectors. So introducing the term wageless life, Michael Denning has insisted on the centrality of unwaged labor in our society and criticized notions such as wasted life, which associate some individuals to garbage and reinforce the image that they are not source of capitalization. So to me, this point is particularly useful for understanding also how life, who are destitute and who are stranded in camps like in Lesbos become source of value, but not only in the sense of being turned into cheap labor force, right? So extractive humanitarianism, to conclude, is for me a lens for coming to grips with value production and labor exploitation in refugee governmentality in their parasitic and insidious participatory forms. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very dense and full of insights, and I hope we can discuss it in the Q&A. So I already have quite a few questions coming in, but before we start the session of questions, obviously whoever has questions for our speakers, just write them in the Q&A box and make sure to specify who it's addressed to. So before we open up to the questions, I actually wanted to ask the speakers a question myself. And I think this is, I'm just being selfish because I haven't been in dialogue with 3 people like you in front of everyone else. So I think I really want to try to think together with your work, through your work. So I've written the question down because I'm going to get emotional, so I prefer to read it so that it contains all the nuances. So I'll just read it. Before we open up to the questions, so I wanted to take this opportunity of asking you guys to join me in this ongoing process of collective thinking, because it's extremely rare for me to think alongside people with your experience and depth of political understanding. So the question is a very topical one, and a lot of, and all of you have touched upon it in your presentations. And of course, I know your work, and I knew that you were going to present on this. So the question is, in what way has your research focus, so Eylul's work on the Middle Eastern counterfuturisms, Nick's work on counterlogistics, what Martina is working on right now with this concept of extractive humanitarianism, which is so topical. In what way has your research focus been impacted by 2020? And or how can your research help us unpack the potential of 2020? I think a lot of researchers are thinking about this. So this is such a privileged opportunity to discuss with you about this. So by 2020, I refer to this Janus-like paradox, right, of unprecedented intensity. On the one side, the epidemic, which has coincided in some parts of the world with the 4th industrial revolution of AI, surveillance, big pharma, the further dismantling of welfare states, of course, where they actually existed before, new regimes of mobility, and very importantly, moralization. I'm thinking about, for example, the new regimes of mobility based on family connections. So new regimes of mobility and moralization being imposed in some places, almost comparable with wartime ones. So also almost to that level of severity. And more generally, of course, yet another crisis paid for by the impoverished, right? The sort of Amazonization of labor, et cetera, et cetera. We know that. So on the other side, some parts of the planet have literally witnessed the unimaginable. So the noisiest wake-up call against racism and colonial amnesia to date. Obviously, I've experienced it from London and through Southern Europe. Abolition has resonated between the US and Europe and Africa like never before. And Nick, you've talked about this directly. The highlight of the British abolitionist summer, for example, has been the toppling of slave trader statue Edward Colston in Bristol. And that happened after 125 years. So it's this proportion of event. In traditionally amnesiac ex-colonial countries like Italy and Portugal, racist assassinations, such as the ones of Willy Monteiro Duarte and Bruno Candé, were no longer ignored. So this also happened this summer. And as Sandro Mezzadra put it in a webinar, much in echo with Deleuze's exhortation to invent new weapons, Mezzadra in a webinar said, literally talking about the new generations of activists in comparison to Italy's sort of traditional militant activist generations. He said, the TikTok generation turned platforms into weapons. So I think that was quite an iconic sentence that I remembered. So I guess my question is a very open one. My question is, in the light of this 2020, in what way do your researches and your methodologies of analysis provide useful weapons for the generations to come? Maybe people haven't been born yet. So for the protagonists of the next 2020s to come. So this is quite a broad question, but I just wanted to kind of reflect together with you through this sort of paradox. And just, that was the question. So who wants to start?
I can start if you want. Thanks a lot for the very key, topical question. So in relation to my research, yeah, this is something that I didn't mention in the presentation, but of course there have been transformation after the onset of COVID-19 going on. And I think it's an extremely interesting moment, particularly now, to when we are forbidden to do fieldwork. In fact, is right now the moment to do fieldwork and to understand, the multiple and hidden border transformation going on. Regarding my specific research, I think that, well, more than how my research can be useful, that this is something that I've, to understand the current moment, that is something that I have no idea about. I think that is interesting to remark that, well, of course, COVID-19, many people have said, has become like a source of acceleration, right, of many politics that were already going on. But also what I just explained in terms of like the progressive digitalization of refugee humanitarianism is only partly true, right? So what for instance, I could observe doing fieldwork soon after the first lockdown is that this kind of technologization that we were all expecting in Greece was not there, right? So there was like also a struggle in implementing technologies in places like Lesbos, for instance. So this is the first thing. At the same time, of course, there has been some kind of acceleration of political process. For instance, just to give an example, this Viber app that I just showed was like used, started to be used after the first lockdown, and now asylum seekers are obliged to lodge their asylum application online, right? In the name of keeping distance. But to me, what is interesting is that there have been a shift in the humanitarian rationale. So soon after COVID-19, both in Greece and in Italy, there have been like border closure made in the name of refugees' own good. So let's close the port to save the migrants. Let's protect them in the camps, in the hotspots, in order to avoid that they can infect, but also they can be infected. So I think that this is a quite relevant shift in the way in which humanitarian control justified itself in the name of people's good. And to me, Oana, you just mentioned, apart from COVID-19, abolitionism and the multiple struggles that happened this year that represent the other side of the coin. And to me, abolitionism is a particularly powerful analytical lens for rethinking a critique to the border regime, which goes beyond a no border logics. So what I'm working right now is a book project called Border Abolitionism that try precisely to incorporate also this analysis on extractive humanitarianism by bridging literature on abolitionism with critical migration literature. That means basically looking at this interlocking mechanism of racialization that affect migrants and non-migrants. Yeah, I would stop here for now.
Nick, I'll unmute you.
Thank you very much for that excellent question. I think the most direct answer is, of course, that the research I presented is driven by this new generation of struggles to which you refer. And it's actually important to, again, to underline that my work on this has been conducted with a handful of younger scholars, several with complex connections to the various arenas of struggle which we've been talking about. And so for me, I often have had the exciting feeling of having my research agenda pushed forward by precisely by my younger collaborators and learning in that process, because I will say that when I detailed 3 pulses in one cycle of network struggle: ultramondialism, the Occupy movement, and the current cycle. I was involved in both the first and second waves of that, but after Occupy, I was to some degree pessimistic about the prospects for future network struggles in light of the growing evidence of the panoptic and surveillance powers of the security state. I think that what I've learned from researching this new wave of struggles is, in fact, that there is now a huge new reservoir of ingenuity and determination and analysis being applied to the generation of new struggles, which has many features, new compositions, which are bringing together categories of gender, racialization, and class in a synthesis which I think escapes many previous optics, and tactics which, although they draw on a long lineage of urban uprisings, as we've tried to indicate, have dramatically new features. So the way in which I would position the value of the research which I and my collaborators are undertaking is really simply as participants in the attempt to circulate these struggles and to encourage their own self-recognition and self-clarification of the dynamics which have been unleashed. Academics such as myself, have a peculiarly privileged and advantageous position, and the use value to which our research can be put is, I think, precisely in adding our contribution and whatever accelerants we can already put to the very rapid process of discussion, comparison, and self-education that is going on within this new movement.
Thank you, Nick. Eylul?
Yeah, I think I have two ways of answering this. One is like, if I think about what happened in 2020, especially in the Middle East, many things happened beyond COVID, actually. And especially also exactly what I'm talking about, like not comparing, but putting in a, putting Dubai and Beirut into the same picture to understand the class formation and wealth accumulation in the region. To be honest, I was not sure if I'm on the right track, does it work or not, and so on. But the explosion happened in Beirut, and then United Arab Emirates deals with Israel and so on. So it's really unfolded as actually my project made more sense to me. There are things that we need to unpack like between these different scenes, different events. Of course, there are like ongoing protests happening in the Middle East. There is also so-called like second wave of Arab Spring from Iraq to Lebanon since 2018. I think Niv, like what Nick told us about, like, Nick also mentioned these examples, but I think like these new forms of struggles and riot platforms. But also as a media theorist, not like a contextual reflection, but like as a media theorist, actually I would like to refer to one of Nick's books called Cyber Proletariat, because it's in the opening, it starts with like talking about this like a venture that started using AI decision-making news, and he says that like, and there's this news in 2007, and then there's also this like mining, like a disaster, like the disaster at the mine in Turkey happened because of the, like, basically it's a state violence, because of the duties, like lack of necessary protection and control. So, and he says that we need to understand this, like why these two things are happening at the same time. And for me, this is an anecdote that I'm from Turkey, so it's like struck me a lot. I wasn't expecting on the second page like that kind of a reference. But I think why I give this example, because as you mentioned, Oana, like there are two things that you discuss, like how this, like a rapid digitization of our life, like even more speeded up. But at the same time, we see like the like the impossible, like the city exploded itself, like not itself, but like by the, again, as another example of state violence, what happened in Beirut. But I think we need to understand these two things at the same time, what I'm trying to get, and as a media theorist. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Eylul. So we're going to go to the questions. The first question will be for Eylul, and I'm going to put together two questions. So the first question is from an anonymous, and it says, in which relation is Gulf futurism to other forms of futurisms in the Middle East? So, and in general to the wider definition of Arab futurisms. And this I would put together with Luciana Parisi's question, which is, thank you for your talk. And in your research, does Gulf futurism project a universal mode of computation, or is it already conditioned by counterfuturisms from within the borders? Mm. So both questions kind of have that same focus.
Okay. Yeah. I think I will go with the second option of like it's. I don't see like a Gulf futurism as a one and only universal model. Actually, I think my work is trying to get the idea that it's actually always contested or performed and negotiated. In that sense, actually, like with this conference, I started to think more about like a cosmotechnics, because it's like one of the popular terms of the conference. And I was thinking like, if I could think these examples as examples of like cosmotechnics in a way, like really negotiating the universal models in locality. And in that sense, as these questions highlight, like there's the issue of scale, like because I emphasize like local efforts and so on, but I also put an emphasis on transnational perspective. And for me, it's important to talk about how these local struggles or engagement with technology are being discussed, not as an example from the Middle East, but as a as a engagement, like specific examples that could inform our understanding of like what actually that technology means or does, its potential, its limits, and so on. So it speaks to a larger context. It's same with the capital as well. If it's a universal model or not, like that's the same thing. Like I'm looking at it from the vantage point of the Middle East, but it's not like a relativism as we discussed also in this conference, like between the relationships. So I'm not like offering a critique of universalism and end up with like all local struggles and so on, but actually I try to make it like I build a more complex relationship between universal and local in this sense.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think this kind of talks to the next question, to Nick from Anonymous. And the question is, in terms of technology and cosmotechniques, the question is, what does counter logistics do with technology?
It's an enormous question. I think that we can identify perhaps a dual process. On the one hand, it clearly reappropriates certain aspects of technology. I mean, that's the burden of the Riot Platform analysis. However, at the same time, it turns that appropriation against some of the overarching dynamics which have driven the trajectory of capitalist technological development. So what I'm trying to suggest is something that is much more paradoxical than any linear accelerationist perspective. I think that perhaps we have to think in terms of processes of appropriation of global computation, which are at the same time in many ways turned against the very direction in which the dominant project of global computation is pointing. And so this, I mean, to bring it down to ground a little bit more, I think we see this paradox at work in terms of the deployment of surveillance against surveillance. And if we take the example of Black Lives Matter, the deep involvement, a very constitutive role, which digital technologies have played in that movement, in terms of giving activists the ability to record, distribute evidence of police brutalization, and aggregate it so that it's no longer simply a local matter, and to recontextualize it within a counter-narrative about white supremacist violence. All of that is integral to what has been called hashtag activism. But that hashtag activism is turned against the apparatus of big data policing, with all its panoply of preemptive policing and AI facial recognition technologies, and so sets out to subvert that dominant technological play. I don't know whether that goes towards answering what you were after, but that's the best I can do at this point.
Thank you, Nick. So a question for Martina from Luciana Parisi. Thank you for your talk. Do these multiple modes of data extraction, which transform refugees in techno users of mobile platforms, for instance, show that there is a form of labor that goes beyond the idea of free labor or human labor? In which way do migrants and refugees capture a form of knowledge production that become intensified in techno-extractive communication and logistic platforms?
Thank you for the question. So regarding forms of labor that goes beyond human labor and free labor, yes, absolutely. And in particular, forms of labor, I would say that goes beyond free labor, because this is what what I try to explain in the talk, referring to this unpaid labor. And in particular, this is labor that, of course, asylum seekers are not even like aware to perform. They don't know. I mean, this is a question of, knowledge is crucial, right? They don't know how key the information and the feedback, because this is what they are asked to do, right? Send feedback and information about their use of technology and about their life coping strategies are essential for the reproduction, and if you want to put in your term, the recursivity of the border regime. And also, yeah, to some extent is also forms of labor that goes beyond human labor. Yes, I agree, because in the end, there is also the labor that they perform by just interacting with humanitarian actors through these platforms, and even in this case, well, there is a whole research to be done. For instance, what I didn't mention in the talk is that in order to lodge the asylum application, they need to pre-book their appointment with the Greek authorities with a mandatory Skype call system. So there is this platform that since 2016 has been receiving this app asylum seekers request, right? And of course, we don't know, there are no the agreements between Skype and the Greek authorities and the UNHCR has never been clarified. And so there are all these conversations going on in this chat. And definitely technologies, this forced mediation accelerate these forms of free labor that migrants do not perceive as such. And there is, at the moment, quite wide literature, in particular in media studies on these platforms in refugee governance that are used as mediations, right? And to me, well, it's very important to question this neutrality of this mediation. That is first is a forced mediation. They are obliged, it's the only condition for getting access to rights. And second, what are the circuits of value behind this? And regarding the kind of knowledge that the migrants are able to capture, I think I'm more pessimistic. I'm probably more tempted to say that is the contrary. How these international agencies capture and state authorities capture knowledge production that is very detailed, right? The kind of service that I show you, but also the questions when they go in detail, for instance, Frontex asking questions to the migrants that are similar to what they might expect in an asylum interview, right? But there is this constant circles of they are constantly asked to answer this question, even if they are considered subject to who lie, right? Authorities don't trust asylum seekers, but they constantly need their speech, their information, and without having rights in exchange, because of course, as part of these voluntary surveys that they take part to, they don't have anything in exchange, but they might be scared if they say no. And I would say that in my, at least my very partial understanding, is very difficult to see how migrants can capture these forms of knowledge production, and is a constant struggle for them to get rid of the opacity that is really in part deliberately, in part for other, I mean, in a non-intentional way, produced in the asylum regime. So to understand what are the right procedure, this production of opacity regarding the rules that they need to follow.
Thank you, Martina. So another question for Nick from Tiziana Terranova. Thank you so much for your presentation. Looking at the scholarship that emerged out of the 2011 riots, such as Zeynep Tufekci, is the ephemeral nature of such movements that grow quickly but do not produce organization. Another point made is also the ways in which disinformation has become a key weapon of information warfare, producing confusion, cynicism, and disenchantment. How do you feel that these latest waves of riot differ in this sense? What do you think are the long-term effects and overall duration of network protests?
Yeah. Hello, Tiziana. Of course, those are wonderful. Those are wonderful questions. I think that the question of the duration of these movements is still in the balance and unresolved at this point. However, I would say that in many respects, the movements do seem to have shown greater durability than Tufekci's critique might have suggested. The persistence which has emerged from in movements such as the Gilets jaunes and in others of these protest movements, their capacity to sustain very high levels of confrontation with the security forces over periods not just of weeks, not just of months, but in some cases of years, suggests that lessons are being learned, and that the sort of ephemerality that she pointed to is not a necessary concomitant of these movements. One might think also of the fact that Black Lives Matter provides in all its complexity, provides an example of a movement which has been in existence for some 6 or 7 years, might have been considered almost dormant at some point, but then re-exploded, showing perhaps a sort of episodic and non-linear path of development, which is important. Of course, the issue of the also exists of what other forms of action the platform riots might mutate into. I wouldn't exclude the possibility, for example, that Joshua Clover's famous riot strike, riot prime formula might in fact sprout another limb, as it were, so that we see riot strike, riot strike prime with a new wave of organizing within various digitalized industries, which has in fact, in ways which have in fact been influenced by these new urban uprisings. So, you know, as Chavan Lai said about, asked about the French Revolution, one has to answer, it's still too soon to say, but I think these things are in play.
definitely. Thank you, Nick.
Oh, yeah. There was another part of Tiziana's question about information war, but I've already gone on a bit. So why don't we can come back to that later on if we want. I have something to say about that.
Yeah, I think maybe we can tie it to the question to Eylul, because there's a question here about art. And I think the way it ties in with the second part of Tiziana's question to you, as is through this point of cynicism, right? So the production of cynicism as an informational weapon on the one side, and I think that's very visible in the way abolitionist protests have been framed, right, in the media, at least in the UK. So on the one side, we're talking about cynicism as an informational weapon, but this anonymous question is actually connected to cynicism, connected to art practices. And I would suggest probably the question is hinting at possible critiques around contemporary art in terms of appropriation or commodification of say, radicality or dissent. So I'm sure Eylul can tell us what how she sees this. The question is, Sophia Murray's art practice seems to ventriloquize, replicate and fetishize the very look and feel of what she critiques. By using the same tools of the very neoliberal aesthetics it supposedly critiques. Well, after Berlin Biannual a few years ago, DIS, another artist collective from the US with a similar modus operandi were criticized for cynicism and somewhat redirected their video work to social issues. What is that the work of Al-Maria and Al-Qadiri do you think actually offers beyond glamorizing the problem and making it into another sparkling video gem in a gallery? Equally unclear the connection to Blade Runner, a dystopian drama reflecting on anthropomorphic loop. So I guess, yeah, Eylul, how do you feel about the usage of art in this context?
Thank you, Anna. And thank you for whoever asked the question, because I think it's an important question to raise. And actually, that's why I included Gulf labor coalition's work, for instance. Like, it's not like the who are, okay, I will, first of all, I will start with Sophia Murray. I agree with this way of putting, like describing her work. So I think this is why I would like to include her, because it's because she also one of the artists who really invested in the concept of Gulf-futurism, what it could mean or what its aesthetic and political implications. But for me, I also see like I couldn't work with her work actually, in the sense that like it doesn't give a space that we talk about how it is related to other struggles or other urban context, or different struggles within the same urban space and so on. So it's like, it's a kind of a more like a, but I think find important that there is this kind of a term coined, like Gulf-futurism, because I think it really represents the geopolitical aesthetic of Gulf capital, in, if I use the Frederick Jameson's terms, like the manifesting the contradictions through which it operates across economic and cultural realms. So in that sense, I'm happy that this concept exists and that people have different takes on it. And she has a specific takes on it, that I see the critique that like it could be and fetishizing or reproducing the thing that she criticized. But at the same time, I think she takes the question of technology at a very personal level, a social level at once. I think it's an important reflection as well, like how it plays out in a cultural level, or in a personal narrative, that we see the manifestations of Gulf capital. But if I connect to why I also gave other examples, especially the example of like Gulf Labor Coalition, the group of artists, like international group of artists and activists that use like old school methods of like boycotts and so on, like and engage with, like mobilize their own affordances that come from their profession and networks, and they use them to actually make demands for migrant workers. For me, it's very important that like actually different social classes that come together within a given space, but also across like different spaces, that could actually stand for one another, not because of the same only one cause that are like affecting all at the same time at the same level, but standing for one another and understanding the position of oneself within this like geopolitical system. So in that sense, actually, I'm really happy about like the growing works, artistic and like theoretical or textual works on how it's not enough to imagine new futures or speculative futures, which has become even more popular now with the COVID-19, like it's the new normal, what is new normal, or what kind of, or design, speculative design and so on. And this is where money goes, right? Like, so we will see here and then more, I guess, at universities or art exhibitions and so on. So I think it's not only like about speculating on what like a future will look like, especially by design practice and so on, but actually architects or designers at various levels could actually stand with the workers that they're actually working with, or they can unionize among themselves. So it's not like only even visioning or building new futures, but it's important to mobilize our own affordances that come from our classes, citizenship, or like international networks and so on, to actually mobilize demands for the people that we are engaging with in a society, but also in a workplace. So in that sense, what I would like to trying to highlight is that I'm not saying that artworks will do the thing. Artists could mobilize, as the example of a Gulf Labor Coalition, for other ends. If it's I don't know if I answered the question, but I'm not essentializing artistic practice in any sense. Nobody could be that naive about writing about that's why also actually on my slides I try to include where the images are coming and going. There's all this economy behind all these images, all these artistic production, exhibitions, which part of the world they are exhibited, and so on. And even for me, when I'm preparing slides, it's important for me that what kind of image that I use, because we are being part of this economy by just preparing slides.
Yeah. Thank you. I think you.
And sorry to interrupt you. Just one clarification about the connection to Blade Runner fantasies and dystopian future. In 2014, I think there was a Vice magazine with the title of Blade Runner Fantasies of Princes, and it was one of the first a very popular work that really highlighted actually Gulf futuristic fantasies are killing people, migrant land citizen workers. So it was that kind of a gesture, and I think the idea is that all these new futures are actually pretty dystopic, as they promote as development, progress, and so on. For many.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that answer, Eylul. I think, for me personally, what you touched upon, that is very important, and it's something that is very important in terms of Riot and obviously migrant justice struggles as well, is the very complex aspect and practice of coalition politics, right? And how Nick was saying, obviously this wave of mobilization, like you're talking about the sort of labor justice movements in the Gulf, they actually lie on networks of coalition. This is what Joshua Clover was talking about in terms of the commune. And whereas we can see constant reiterations of techno-capital, there's also constant reiterations of coalition politics. I think this is, we should do like another entire event just on that, because it's extremely, it's kind of it's not even about utopia, really. It's about how it actually works in the present. And we do see it in that sense. And this is a bit like that quote about TikTok being new weapons, which is sort of paradoxical, constantly makes me think about the novelty of the new waves of organization and new forms of organization, especially also considering that the last waves of protest were mainly promoted in a very, how can I say, delicate labor situation. So informal workers, people having lost their jobs. I mean, all of the organizing that happened this summer was in a situation of great fluctuation of labor conditions, at least in the UK, but in so many other places at the same time. So this is, I think it's, I mean, I wrote about the Tunisian Revolution being, the first revolution of the century and promoted by unemployed people. And I think we can discuss about unemployment or underemployment, but to me, that is one of those like little features that should be looked more into, or that we could discuss more, especially in relation to coalition politics, which is an old term to actually talk about new things or ongoing things, fortunately. So I wanted to go back to Nick with this, what you wanted to say about cynicism as an info weapon. And then I'll ask a question to Martina, and then we can have the final remarks.
Yeah, well, I'll try and be really quick on this, because I'm actually more interested in the line that you started about coalition politics. So, but the observation that I was going to make in reply to Tiziana's question about information war is that, of course, one of the things that is going on in the current wave of struggles is that we see superimposed on it the emergence of what might be called a new Cold War politics, with increasing, I would describe them as intercapitalist tensions between the United States, China, Russia, etc. And in this situation, what happens is that there are political attempts by the national security states of these respective players to appropriate the domestic rebellions within their opponent states. So you see, Russian agents attempting to, even AstroTurf, Black Lives Matter meetings, and at the same time, you see both China accusing the United States of promoting the Hong Kong revolt as a sort of color revolution. And there are very complex dynamics around this. But to me, what is encouraging about the current wave is, of course, the various attempts to reach across these new Cold War boundaries, such that one sees emergent dialogues between Hong Kong activists and Puerto Rican activists about post-colonial sovereignty, or the sort of connections that were made between some Hong Kong activists and Black Lives Matter militants. But so that's a quick answer to that. But I'm very interested, actually in this thread that started running about coalition politics. I did have some questions both for Martina and Eylul, which sort of give on to that, but I don't know if you want to go in that direction, so I'll leave it to you.
This is I don't know. This is a really tough decision, honestly.
Cool, yes.
Started talking about I'm kind of like, I'm gonna be that annoying person who says it's more like a comment, not a question.
Fine.
Because obviously we have these
That's
people
fine.
on Zoom.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna say it, and then I'm gonna leave the floor to you to ask the questions to Eylul and Martina. So basically, what I wanted to signal is what Martina talked about in terms of Moten and Harney's term in the Undercommons, the invitation to governmentality, and what Martina calls a detention from below. I think it's very important to think about that sort of moral articulation in the context of the epidemic. So I just want to leave that there just to signal it, that I think it's a very important thread to continue discussing and thinking about, and especially in terms of new moral articulations, which is not something necessarily talked about that much, but in the governance of the epidemic governance, there's a lot of new moral articulations. So I don't know if Martina, you want to include this and connect it with Nick's question. Nick, do you want to?
Maybe. Well, since I'm sorry, but I have a departmental meeting, so I need to go very soon. If you told me, Oana, that you need to ask a question, there was a question for me, right, before?
Yeah, this was just a comment, and if Nick, if you want to ask your question,
yeah,
and then
sure.
if Martina...
Yeah, really quickly, Martina, can you say something about the process of migrant self-organization and how it stands in relation to the technological dynamics that you've portrayed, whether it be in terms of refusal or of reappropriation, whatever?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think I explained that I tell you about the struggle, but first of all, I have to say that it's very tricky as a terrain, precisely for the reason that Oana stressed, and I also mentioned in the paper, so that this the fact of accepting technologies is the only way for them to also getting access to rights and to the asylum procedure and to the financial support. So of course, is rather, I mean, what we observe in this field is rather that migrants are struggling for getting access also to, for instance, to the debit cards, right? Some people are excluded from that. So of course they don't criticize technology, and honestly, the huge majority of migrants doesn't care that this technology eventually might end up in more control, right? Because they are already very much controlled since the very moment when they leave their fingerprint. So there is this kind of obsession in, for instance, in some kind of migration literature about, well, they might be tracked and what about their data? But of course, this is not the main migrant concern, right? So this is the first thing, that how they structure their struggle is not in the direction of, I refuse technologies because I can be tracked more, right? And also because there is this need of using technology, accepting this technology for getting access to all these services. In terms of struggle, it's been very interesting in Greece because so in summer 2018 and again in 2019, migrants, asylum seekers mobilized. And I use this term not because I want to reiterate the distinction between migrants and refugees, but I think it's important to stress that these people are managed and captured and governed by these humanitarian actors, right? So they are asylum seekers, so they need to comply with a series of rules and with hoping that at some point they would get some form of protection. So for 2 years, they organized collective struggles. They occupied UNHCR buildings for more than 1 month. So the UNHCR officer could not go to work to ask to get cards. these prepaid cards, because many were excluded in an arbitrary way, totally arbitrary way. Some others because the rules of, to get the cards change in times, right? And so they end up being excluded, or they didn't receive the monthly financial support. And the struggle was successful. So in the end, they managed to obtain the cards. And another interesting struggle in relation to technology has been this collective struggle against the Skype system. And this was not because this mandatory Skype system for lodging the asylum application. And this was not because they were scared about Skype, right? The Skype could track them, but because Skype is an obstacle. Because some people don't have a smartphone, don't have a laptop, and in particular, they don't have internet connectivity, and the line is always busy, right? To get, so it takes weeks or even months to some of them to just pre-book an appointment with the Greek authorities. So these there's couple, two relevant struggles, I would say. And also, well, of course, there are more individual struggles for not being tracked, for instance, or appropriating this kind of compulsory technology. For instance, of course, there have been asylum seekers who managed to get the financial support twice because there was a jam, a glitch in the database. So they were able to run from a refugee camp to another and to get the financial support twice. But to me, it's very important not to overstate, not to mythicize these struggles, right? Because of course, in this condition, migrants don't want to struggle. They just want to get their financial support and in particular to get their asylum, the refugee status and move on. So I think they struggle as everyone does in this condition. When they are entrapped in these kind of asymmetric power relations, but it's very difficult to withdraw from this participatory detention from below, because of the very critical situation in which they are, also from a legal point of view, and also the willingness of withdrawing themselves. Well, why shall they refuse to use this technology in the end? This is, to me, one of the main interesting questions of this specific field, that it pushes us to problematize also criticisms to technology in light of the fact that they need it.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you need to leave, we're just gonna, Nick, if you want to ask the question to Eylul, and then we can.
Yeah. So, Eylul, in your very interesting discussion of the situation in Lebanon, you mentioned, in a sense, two currents. One was the major street protests against the client state and financial corruption, and then the other was the unionization of care workers and the labor struggles. And I wondered if you could tell us what sort of contact or connection existed or did not exist between these two different manifestations.
Yeah, actually, before, a countrywide protest broke out in October 2019. Actually, that summer, in summer 2019, there were already protests happening in refugee camps in Lebanon. So actually, I think it's not they were happening at the same time and also interacting with one another, but also have their own specific agenda as they have different urgencies. And especially during the protest, there were some, so the protest continued for months, and there were different events every day, or weekly events and so on. And actually, there were some chantings or some events that are also organizing, directly addressing domestic migrant workers who could not go outside actually, but they were for instance, a women's march that's that the migrant workers like joined from the balconies and so on. So there were like that kind of scenes. And actually the idea of like Lebanon's revolution would not be complete if migrant workers and refugees are not also part of the picture, part of the demands, and so on. So it's like a very short, simple, especially just a reflection of the one like last year. But there are also like they also made a use of another connections and made a, not made a use of, but like the popularity of Black Lives Matter, as it like broke out again, like in the US. They also mobilized around it very well for also international connections. And actually, I think the protest regarding like the abuse and violences that migrant workers are facing become like a more accessible in a way. And the grassroots organizations that I mentioned, they really adopt like a feminist and anti-racist approach along like labor issues. And there are some reforms are happening, by the way. But of course, the enforcement of those legal regulations and are not like very traceable. But what like I'm trying to say is that like for me, what I see in Lebanon, maybe it's an optimistic reading from away, especially after pandemic, like but I see like I'm learning from what's happening in Lebanon in terms of like how race, gender, and class could play in terms of coalition politics within a given urban space that is actually facing too many urgencies at once right now.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Eylul. I think this is an amazing note to close on. So thank you so much, Eylul, Nick, Martina, for sharing your work so generously with me and our audience. And I hope this is just the start of a longer conversation. I'll invite everyone to tomorrow's session, which is episode 9, Pirate Modernity and Hypersocial Networks. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.